about the things that you did and the things that you do. And open us to your word and your word to us. Calm our minds. Surround us with your angels of mercy and protection. Pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. Now, the first time I helped out at a wedding, I was in seminary. I was in my 20s. I'd been to a lot of weddings. I was a pastor's kid. I've been to tons of them. But I had never helped out as a pastor. And my little church in Vancouver was colorful, to say the least. It was about the same size as this church. It was about 30 people. And most of them were mentally ill, homeless, or drug addicted, and usually all three. So it was an interesting place to be a pastor. And you had some interesting pastoral visits and other things, and there I was as an intern, and an intern is like a pastor janitor, chair stacking and that kind of thing, making sure the pastor's tie is straight, that kind of thing. Now there were about 30 people, and one day Jake and Tanika decided that they wanted to get married. Jake and Tanika. Now, if I tell stories like this, I never use anyone's real name, just so you guys know. Their names weren't Jake and Tanika, and so I try to be careful with that. And when I tell stories about you guys, I try not to use your real name either. Sometimes. Don't try very hard. But Jake was out of prison at the time, and Tanika wasn't using meth too heavily, and they'd been a couple for years, so they decided to make it legit. It's also not a real picture, though, by the way. My supervising pastor, Don, allowed me to take part as an assistant for the wedding. So we had Jake, who was unshaven, gangly white ex-con, and Tanika, who was a stick-thin Native American girl with an infectious smile and a long-running drug habit. We set them up in the little office building where we had church, and the ceremony began at least a half an hour late, and people arrived straggling in various levels of chemical enhancement. It was an interesting day. Some of the guests lived on the street, so they just woke up and walked in. Parking was not an issue at this wedding. My assisting duties entailed making a sign for the wedding, which I finally just printed out on an 8x11 piece of paper that said Jake and Tanika's wedding with an arrow. That was the decorations. It was very nice. And Tanika's brother and cousin were supposed to walk her down the aisle. Of course, one of them didn't show up and didn't show up and didn't show up, and we thought, well, just go ahead with it. And then they said, if he finds out you went ahead with it, you'll have to call the police because there will be teeth on the floor. And we said, okay, we will wait. So we waited, because we were waiting anyway. And finally he showed up, and they both walked down to George Jones's classic, Just One More. Anybody know that one? Just one more glass of wine and another. It was a moment, I'll tell you. I tell you. So they stood there, two people who had been beat up by life badly and had hit back many times. And Jake kept looking around. He'd be standing here with, going like this, and he's looking out the window. Jake, turn around, turn around, turn around. Turned out to be my other assistant pastor job. Jake, turn around. Did that the whole time. But I'll never forget, my supervising pastor, Don, was there in a suit and tie. And he never wore a suit and tie. He wore what I wear to church and less. But he put a suit and tie on. Everybody else is in sweatpants and jail shoes and whatever they had on. And in a moment, that was the lesson. That in this afternoon, in this gritty and grimy life, they were beautiful. The wedding was beautiful. And Tanika was the young Cree Indian girl just off the reservation. And Jake was the football high school star who was ready to take on the world. And that night, they would be high and drunk again, and they'd be back out wherever. But for that moment, the world stood still. Vintage Jesus is our title for today. Vintage Jesus. We started a new series last week called Jesus the Demolition Artist. And again, we're in the middle of an experiment. We're using what many of our Christian brothers and sisters throughout the world use, which is the lectionary, which is the list of readings that are used globally in Christian churches. And it takes us through all of Scripture within a 3-year cycle. Right now, we just finished Epiphany, which celebrates when the wise men came. And we're in the middle of that, and the next thing on the calendar is Transfiguration Sunday. So we're in these readings. This is a group of reading about the beginning of Jesus' career. It's where Jesus comes on the scene. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each choose different stories from his life to begin his ministry, and each has a different thing to say. And our series is called Jesus the Demolition Artist because he often had to demolish expectations of what God's deliverance was going to look like for everyone. His kingdom was not going to be one of military conquest or political power. His rule wouldn't be one of ruling fiercely, but of servanthood. Instead of hanging out with the religious cream of the crowd, he spent his time with the boys and girls from the block, Jake and Tanika. Last week we talked about Jesus' baptism by his eccentric cousin John the Baptist. John referred to the threshing floor, while Jesus will go with his winnowing fork to separate the wheat from the chaff. Jesus, the demolition artist, who didn't just come to save those who already think they're saved, but to tell us all that we need an overhaul. We all need to be thrown on the threshing floor and start from scratch only by his grace. We then talked about how Jesus does his demolition art in our lives. He breaks us down. He takes away our sin and self-dependence. How we can reframe our struggles that we go through as Jesus reforming and refining us, getting that useless chaff of sin and distraction away so that the wheat remains. And we start out with Luke, his blunt, economically themed gospel, as it records the emergence of Jesus on the scene. And today we go to John, which was the last gospel written down. And John is very developed in its theology and its mysticism. It's very delicately drawn. And it records the first miracle of Jesus at the most human of celebrations and ceremonies, a wedding. I share the story about Jake and Tanika's wedding, one of the most colorful I've been to. And they drifted back and forth to church, and who knows what they're up to now. But the moment was beautiful. Right in the midst of stress and bitternesses of life on the streets, they were raised up for a moment to be celebrated. And today we have a story of a wedding where something went wrong. And who doesn't have a story like that? In my own wedding, my 2-year-old niece was absolutely gorgeous, and she walked down the aisle as the flower girl and distributed not a petal, and put the basket at my feet and walked away. And I went and grabbed her and picked her up, and then we went and we put all the petals down. And it was wonderful. It was this great mistake that turned out to be one of the things that people remember the most. Sometimes the mistakes are a little more stressful than that. I had a friend who went to a wedding where at the reception there was a champagne pyramid of champagne glasses. And Eddie went forward and he took a glass and the walls came tumbling down. Interesting. But they sort of wish Jesus had been there to turn it all back into water. It would have been easier to clean up. But anyway, I was at a wedding where the preacher would not stop talking. And he was trying to dismiss the bride and groom, and he just kept talking and talking and talking until the groom's father said, "Play ball!" and let them go. Yes. So, does anybody else have a funny wedding story? Because I would love to hear one. Or a...
I don't know if mine's funny or not, but it's one thing that really sticks out about something that went awry. And they were, at those days, got married in we did anyway, in a hall at one of the hotels there. And they ran the runner down, and it was really long. And the guys that were taking care of that didn't know what to do with all the surplus, so they opened up the door to the stairwell and tossed it out.
A little extra wedding runner. It's hard to know what to do with that. Yes? Sharon?
Well, mine isn't funny. I never got to go to my reception. I got in to receive it, but the ceremony was at 1 o'clock, the reception was supposed to start at 1:30.
Well, Abner was in a hurry, so...
And at 5 o'clock, somebody came up to me and said to me, "Mrs. Washington, your sister-in-law is leaving." And that was the first time I gave him an order. I said, "Let's go." But I never got to my reception.
Never got to your own reception. I never heard that one before. Yeah. All right. Marilyn?
At Chris and Nikki's wedding, the lady who was doing the bridesmaids' dresses was still making them. And so she was sending them over one by one. So the wedding was like, what, 2 hours late. Fortunately,
Oh,
it
goodness.
was our, my sister's husband and another guy that could keep the people going because they were entertainers.
Oh,
But
yeah.
then, of course, by then the kids were really tired
Uh-huh.
because CJ was 6 and Tierra was 3, and they were the ring bearer and the flower girl. So they
Oh.
walked me in with the mothers,
Uh-huh.
and then I had to get up and come back out, and people were wondering, well, what was wrong? And I carried Tierra, and I held CJ, and I passed out the flowers as I went down. And then I sat there.
Uh-huh. Yep. The kids are always the wild card. You never quite know
They weren't going.
what they're gonna do, but they do expend pretty quickly, and they're done. Done.
They were done.
Bill?
We got married in Greencastle, and my mother worked there at the hospital. I like 3 months being 21, and I thought they wouldn't pay any attention to that, so we went ahead and started the wedding. And you found out I was 3 months, I couldn't get married unless I had somebody to sign for me.
Really?
My mother or dad or they had to stop it, send somebody out to get them.
It was a paperwork problem then, huh? Yeah. Yep. That's interesting. That's interesting. In a Canadian ceremony, it is traditional for the bride and groom, to leave kind of in the middle with the pastor and sign the wedding license, and then come back and finish the ceremony. It's the strangest thing, the first time you go to one, because they just disappear. But there you go. Paperwork is everywhere at a wedding. I do remember some issues with ours too on the morning of. Yeah, absolutely. So
There's always that special moment.
always something.
Always remember.
Now, weddings are very human, very stressful, very memorable occasions.
And
I have yet to hear any stories about smooth weddings because nobody really remembers them. They punctuate our lives. They help us mark out in the constant flow of time that the relationship is special, the day is special. Something miraculous is happening here. And so it was on this day with Jesus. A special day, but not an uncommon practice. In the quiet lives these people lived at the time, it was a huge occasion. There was no movies, there was no bowling leagues, there was no Netflix. They existed to survive and live close to the bone lives. It was hard to tell one year from another. And a wedding was an occasion that broke out of the pace. For the bride and groom, it was one of the most important days of their lives. So the wedding becomes a very common and very powerful biblical image. Throughout the Old Testament, we see examples of God presenting himself as awaiting his bride as a groom. For your maker is your husband, Isaiah 54:5. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so God will rejoice over you, Isaiah 62:5. And on that day you will call me husband, you will no longer call me master, Hosea 2. And then Jesus arrives on the scene and keeps calling himself the groom. How can the friends of the groom fast when he is with them? This wedding feast imagery is all throughout the New Testament as well. And only Jesus here steps in as the groom over and over again. And it all climaxes in the description of the wedding feast of the Lamb in Revelation 19. The biggest wedding party there ever was, with a table that stretches from horizon to horizon. Another guiding image and theme, especially for John, is that of friendship. John is constantly using the term friend. Greater love has no man than this, that lay down his life for his friends. I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. We talked about the 4 loves before, those 4 Greek words for love. The one for the unconditional love of God is agape, and the one for friendship is philia. Friendship love is the one between equals, at least in some sense. It is a relationship in which one is not physically dependent on the other, where they don't need each other to survive. It's one of the relationships that doesn't make life possible, but it makes life worth living. That's philia relationship, for which John is a huge theme. Jesus is constantly talking about how he drew us into philia with himself by his death and resurrection, beyond simple obedience or dependence or servitude, and into friendship with God, which is a different kind of relationship. And the climax of this theme is John 21, where Jesus is restoring Peter and he says, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And he uses two different Greek words in that, which doesn't translate very well into English. But what he's saying is, do you agape me? Do you love me with an unconditional love? And Peter says, of course. And he says, do you agape me? And Peter says, of course. And he says, Peter, are you my friend? And that is the climax of what he's saying. That is the climax for John. God is drawing us into that friendship relationship with him where we aren't just his creation, his servants, his sons and daughters, but finally his friends as well. A fellowship in which we choose each other's company. And I'm very blessed to say that I'm married to my best friend. That romancy, lovey-dovey stuff is great, but it comes and goes. If you've been married for more than 15 minutes, you probably figured that out. The intense physical attraction changes and cools and heats over time. The blood oath commitment we have to each other is extremely important. But in the end, it is our friendship that fills up the dull Wednesday afternoons. I tell newlywed couples that you will spend a lot more time sitting next to each other watching TV than you will staring into each other's eyes. And so it is the theme with John, that Jesus calls us his friends. And he's taking that relationship to a new level. And so is the theme of this odd miracle. If Jesus has hired a PR firm, they would have advised against it. They would have said, hey, you want to start stronger. Start stronger than that. His other miracles are more important. Raising people to life, casting out demons, healing blindness. His other miracles are on that life and death level pretty much all the time. But his opening miracle, he chooses to save the wedding of two nervous teenagers. A short aside here about what's going on. So the wine had run out, and most of us would say, big deal. You do a beer run and you stack it back up. Well, there was nowhere to do a beer run to. And in their case, running out of wine was a social disaster. They would have been thought of as an unlucky couple after that. They would have been looked on with a bit of a sneer. Thought of as unprepared and unreliable for a generation, if not for the rest of their lives.